Good morning, folks. My name is Rob Eyler, and I'm an economist, and thank you to AFWD for sponsoring this today. I'm going to provide you with some data and some thoughts of how economists are looking at the economy going forward toward the end of the year, and also talk about Butte County in California in terms of the more regional and local contexts. Two things, just as maintenance real quick. One is that if you have questions, please use the chat function. We are recording this, so there will be a recording of this available later, as well as the slides. And on the off chance that we lose you due to some internet happenstance, then be assured that you will get a link to a recording of this worst case. So let's get started. The way economists are looking at at least this year starts with the new administration in DC. The new administration is going to have an enormous amount of spending that it wants to get done. Whether or not Congress in its current configuration will get it done is an open question, but we've seen a lot of flurry, at least in the first week or so of the Biden administration, trying to get some money on the move, specifically to help get vaccines in people's arms and really just start to help the process move forward with respect to continuing recovery. The jobs market, as we'll see in a minute, has come back a little bit from its original recovery momentum, and that has stimulated a lot of movement in terms of the Biden administration trying to get off and running right away. We did get more fiscal stimulus passed in December, and we've had those checks start to move. The issue there is that, and this is where the Biden administration is also looking forward, is whether or not we should have a third round of fiscal stimulus that focuses on households getting relief, or if we should do investment in jobs. There's been a lot of talk about made in America and sort of trying to provide more manufacturing possibilities in the United States versus another round of transfer payments or just simply spending at the household level to provide income in the short term. That friction is going to continue in Washington for probably at least the next year. We will see how it goes. So much focus ultimately is on how quickly and how effective vaccines are going to be in our economy and how that is hopefully going to help business decision making and jobs markets all move forward. Because one of the biggest problems that has emerged, as we'll see later in some data, is that our lower wage, lower skill workers are the most harmed by what's happened over the last 12 months. So one of the things that policy is looking at is not only the volume of relief, but the focus of relief with respect to how equitable the relief provide, or the equity relief that it provides in the sense of trying to pick up our lower wage workers versus all workers. So the first couple rounds of fiscal stimulus were very generalized, especially up to a certain income level. We might see a third round be a little bit smaller in terms of the income level that it's focused on. Instead of 150,000, might be down to 75,000 or lower. And that idea is to make at least what is coming out of Washington slightly more equitable, depending on how you define that and depending ultimately how Congress defines that. But that's how economists are sort of seeing the next little bit go. What I want to show you now is are some data with respect to first labor markets, then financial markets, and then the latest forecast coming out of the IMF for the United States to sort of show, and that just came out this morning, the latest and greatest about where we may be going over the next couple of years. This is the labor market in the United States in how people become unemployed. So one of the things that was different about this recession versus, let's say, the Great Recession, you're going to see those two contrasted in a minute, is that this one was really driven by temporary layoffs. So when people lose their job in a temporary fashion, it means their employer has turned off their job for the time being, but fully intends to bring them back when they turn it back on. And that's exactly what we should expect after, what you think of as a natural disaster happening. And we see that big spike on the far right-hand side and then a fade. So that suggests that that did work in terms of some folks getting their jobs back. The problem is that somebody or some of that group also permanently lost their jobs, which is this one. And now the Great Recession is more obvious. And most recessions are typified by the permanent loss of jobs, meaning their employer has simply contracted their workforce and not intending to bring you back, and or your employer no longer exists. That's something that is starting to emerge at a larger volume now in this recession and recovery, the blue area on the far right-hand side. So one of the concerns of economists are we putting policies together that will help shrink the blue part, where the gray part of that graph, the temporary part, should naturally change as recovery gains access to more momentum. If the permanent part of that graph remains permanent for some time, that's where big trouble starts up. The other ways people become unemployed is that they complete a temporary job, they choose to leave their job or quit, they re-enter the labor force, which is an intriguing item to think about because we know that a lot of people have chosen to stay out of work, even though they could have probably gone back and got a job somewhere if they lost a job or have chosen not to take it or not to continue working because of childcare needs at home. As schools have adjusted, childcare facilities have adjusted, we've seen more people come back into the workforce. And this is also people seeing potentially more job opportunities as the economy begins to improve. The other part is folks that are just new to the labor force and haven't got a job yet, generally high school and college graduates. So that rainbow look on the far right-hand side is the new concern in the labor market for economists, and what policies come forward is meant to shrink all those colors as best as possible, really the gray and the blue. Now, at an industrial level, the jobs changes in the American economy started bad across the board. So this is April 2020 compared to April 2019 to show how big of a shock it was when the recession began. You can see on the far right-hand side, we're talking about 20%, in some cases almost 50% loss of jobs from 1 year before that. And the far right-hand side is really where most of the damage has happened and remains in our economy with respect to so-called other services, which are like hair salons and nail salons, food services, drinking places, the fancy name for bars and restaurants, and accommodation, the fancy name for hotels that economists use in labor data. Bottom line, a lot of people have lost a job over the last year there, looking April to April. Now, has there been improvement? Of course. Here's November. So you can see the red bar, 6 months later, or 7 months later, we saw a pickup there across the board, and almost every single industry, except for maybe a couple just barely, did not quite get much recovery momentum. But in those lower skill areas on the far right-hand side, we did see recovery. It's in December, unfortunately, that we saw a little bit of give back. So those data on the far right-hand side, the negative 32.1, what that means as of the end of December, 32 out of 100 people who had a job December 2019 were out of work December 2020 in hotel jobs. And then for bars and restaurants, it's almost 1 out of 5. So that is a lot of job loss that's still lingering. Certainly it's picked up from the original lows, but those areas are really where the recession continues to have a shadow. And a lot of it's because of the social restrictions that remain in terms of people trying to travel and also just simply eating out on a regular basis at the same capacity. So if we can solve those two problems, we're going to get a lot of recovery momentum out of picking up jobs in those two areas. But as we'll see later, one of the potential threats that's lingering, and how true the threat is an open question, is whether or not we will see a reduced capacity of bars, restaurants, event facilities, hotels, motels, etc., because of a lack of revenue. And if that lack of revenue lingers, the ability to hire those workers back is then contracted. Now, another way of looking at recovery is, and especially when you want to compare to other recessions and recoveries, and I get asked a lot, is this like 1918? Is it like the Great Depression? Is it like the Great Recession? Is it like some other recession and recovery period? And the answer I usually give is that the best thing we can do for right now is compare it to the Great Recession, not because we entered it the same way, but because the nature of the global economy and even the local economy is much more akin to where we were at in the Great Recession, minus the housing issues locally, which is good, and I'll come back to that in a bit too. But in terms of the way we function with respect to our lives online, offline, in general global connections, the Great Recession is the best way of looking at it. What these data show you is if I start both those recessions at the same time, what's the evolution of jobs after that, and how long does it take to get back to the original volume of workers? So for the US, and I'm going to show you this for California and Butte County in a little while as well. Here is the beginning of the Great Recession on the far left-hand side. The blue line shows you the progression of jobs. We had job losses that lingered for a long period of time. And then ultimately about 76 months later, the American economy finally got back to where it started in November 2007. So that is a long recovery period, and one of the longest. That's why this is deemed the so-called Great Recession, because the cuts were deep. It took a long time for the economy to figure itself out. And when it did, we did have decent recovery momentum, but it took a long period of time. Well, the COVID-19 recession looks like this so far after 12 months. And you can see there was a sharp downturn. Then there looked like a so-called V-shaped recovery was forming, but it's curled off. And the curl off is a problem because, just like I showed you in that graph earlier with the rainbow coloring of the folks that are unemployed, the more those temporary job losses become permanent, the less momentum that black line has to get back up to the red line, which is recovery of the original losses, not growth, just recovery to where we started. So we do have recovery momentum in terms of job market at the national level, but we have seen the last couple of months a little bit of that tail off, literally, as you can see in that black line. Our equity markets, however, have been a good spot in terms of continued growth. Here's the last 3 recessions, including the one we're still currently in. At least we haven't had it declared over yet, but I'll reflect on this more in a minute. You can see that the S&P 500, which is shown here monthly over 20 years, dipped down previous to the recessions, bottomed out either just after or during the recession, and then specifically with the period between the bottom of the market with respect to the Great Recession and where we are today, we've seen an amazing long-term bull market. That bull market has continued even though there's been some ups and downs, especially March and April 2020. But since late April 2020, we've actually been on a really good run. The reasons: one, our lives have moved more to technology. The core of the S&P 500 and of really the market activity in terms of equity markets are driven by technology companies and pulling a lot of other companies behind them, as well as low interest rates. If you jam those two things together, plus basically rising consumer and investor confidence, once we'd gotten through the really dark period initially of the job losses, we've had some restoration of investor confidence over time. How much longer this will last is anybody's guess. I can tell you that you should expect there's going to be this sort of slow metering of profits over time. When you have that kind of growth, you know people are going to want to take money off the table at some point. But the key is having shaped changes in these markets, not panic changes in these markets, where that V on the far right-hand side that you can see bottomed out at 2652 and is now almost 3,700, which is actually sprinkled around a little higher than that now, is panic selling. The other piece of this is watching debt. So debt's important because we expected when this recession began that a lot of people would use credit to get by. Well, households have actually done a pretty good job of navigating it so far, and a lot of that's based on federal stimulus money. So this is the debt that has existed in households at the US level just in mortgage. So you can see that run up on the beginning of it, which is toward the peak of the housing crisis period. These data are quarterly from 2003 forward, sorry. And are inflation adjusted. The inflation adjustment is important because money today that you borrow is worth a different amount than money you would have borrowed 12 years ago. So that evolution of inflation, as slow as it has been, still erodes the amount of money you owe back, which is the reason why we like fixed interest rates in terms of being a borrower. And you can see the total amount of debt after inflation adjustment for housing did not pick up to its height it was at the peak before the Great Recession. So that's good. There wasn't as much exposure going into this recession in terms of debt markets and people owing a lot of money versus what they could pay, even though the threat of their ability to pay back is relatively high when they don't have a job and incomes are somewhat uncertain. So this is core mortgage debt. Then here's home equity lines of credit stacked on top. Then auto lending, credit card lending, student lending, and then some other lending markets. But the bottom line is notice that the peak of these data at the end of Q3 2020 did not rise that much and has still not gone up above the peak before the last recession. So the debt market looks relatively stable, albeit the warning there is that fiscal stimulus has helped a lot with respect to providing incomes and some bridges over troubled water to maintain loan payments, mortgage payments, keeping people in their cars. How much longer that will last really depends on labor market recovery, and that's why we put so much emphasis on jobs growth. The IMF, as I said earlier, has just put out their 2021 and 2022 projections as of just this morning. Here's the US. Loss of inflation adjusted income in 2020. We expected that. It's actually better than what we expected 3 or 4 months ago. And the IMF is predicting a pretty good bounce back year, but from a lower number in 2021 and more moderate growth in 2022. It is not expecting a double dip recession, which is important. And that's really why I'm showing you this. And that's true for most of the advanced economies around the world. So added up everything I've told you before we transition to California and Butte County more specifically. The American economy does have recovery momentum in it. The outlook looks good. We just need to get through the period where we have caseloads falling permanently, not cyclically, or sort of, let's say, for the time being, where we know it's going to rise again. Okay, so decent news at the national and international level for now. Not great because of the last couple months. But now let's look at California, Butte County to provide some statewide and regional contrasts to that. Here are the data as of December, which just came out last week, for Butte County, California, and SAC in terms of thinking the Sacramento metro area. So just to give some contrast of something that is not equal to Butte County, but is a relatively large metropolitan area from which uh, Butte County does feel some reverberations. You can see that all these are relatively similar. California about 8.8% without a seasonal adjustment with respect to unemployment. Butte County 8.2, Sacramento 7.9, all up from November. And the rest of these numbers now all look back 1 year. So we've had loss of labor force. One of the things that's a little alarming is that's almost 5% for Butte County loss of labor force from the previous December. And I'll come back to talk about Butte County's population in a minute. But one of the intriguing parts of that, which we don't know yet, is whether or not that's retirements, people who have walked away from the labor force because they don't know if they're going to have childcare or not. So they are currently not actively seeking work or working, or if they've actually left Butte County or being counted some other place in terms of labor force. But either way you look at it, we still have room to recover, and it's going to take some time. All this tells us, though, that we've come from the original lows, we've come up some ways. And I'll show you more about this for both California and Butte County in just a minute. But I put Sacramento on there to notice that Sacramento is actually probably picking up local labor force as a result of people moving to Sacramento more quickly. Let's look at California in the same graph I showed earlier with respect to comparing the Great Recession to the current recession and the evolution of jobs. Here's the Great Recession in California. I did not seasonally adjust this because the last 12 months are difficult to seasonally adjust given all the volatility and how much it really matters. And if you're an economist, you might be out there kind of wagging your finger around that one. But this basically shows you the evolution in trend. So that's what it looked like for California in the Great Recession. A little bit faster recovery than the national picture overall, but a very similar picture in terms of the last 12 months. So same idea, sharp cut in jobs, got some momentum as the summer progressed, and then up to a certain point where the last couple of months have been a little more tough. And we've seen that now contract a little bit. We need the same thing. That black line needs to continue to move toward the red line. So one way of monitoring progress is that movement. At the industrial level, this is what California looks like month on month, starting in April compared to the previous year. So here is April 2020 compared to April 2019. Notice relatively large percentage losses across most industries in California. Government's the only one by April that had not seen much change, but we're going to see that change in a little while as government saw retirements as well as people get laid off or temporarily laid off, as the case may be. Here's May, June, July, August, and you can see the recovery momentum building into California, September, October, November, and then December is some give back. So again, looking at the far right-hand side, leisure and hospitality, hotels, bars, restaurants, places that we gather for events. 3 out of 10 people, more or less, who had a job December 2019 out of work in that industry, December 2020. A lot of that driven by the Los Angeles metro area, by the way. Other services, about 1 in 5. Hair salons, nail salons, auto body shops, a bunch of different industries that don't really fit in any other category. Also, again, relatively deep. Farming, if you notice on the left-hand side, California farmers have had a really tough year because of all the supply chain issues and just really the contraction of demand. Those are down about 13 out of 100 people are out of work in farming. But otherwise, not great numbers, but a lot better than it was, as you can see from that blue bar, which is the beginning, to the latest, which is marked by those percentage changes. Looking forward, the governor's budget that just recently came out had a forecast for employment as a way of thinking about how the economy is ultimately going to get back to the amount of people working that it had before the recession, really January 2020. These data are quarterly from 2005 forward, all the way to a forecasted level in the end of 2024 now. Now, it's a little weird to look out much more than a couple years, but the governor's budget through the Department of Finance does this because they're concerned about what the next few years are going to look like, if there's going to be additional deficits that they need to finance, and or where the revenue is going to come from to make sure that we basically have a zero budget. Well, here's job evolution from during that period where everything before the 110.5 was pre-COVID-19, including the Great Recession, which I'm now going to shade. And then this is the current recession. So I told you earlier that the shading of that current recession, or the time period of the current recession, is likely to end in Q4 2020, meaning that the National Bureau of Economic Research that does the recession dating is likely to tell us that the recession ended in Q4 2020, but there will be lingering effects, just like every other recession. The recovery period will now show its face. And you can see that to the right-hand side of that second shaded area, that slow positive evolution toward the number 110.0. Well, once we reach that, which the Department of Finance is predicting should happen between Q3 and Q4 of 2024, we will have got the same number of people that were working in January 2020, which is the 110.5, basically back working in California. So it's about a 5-year stretch, more or less, with respect to the job losses that were incurred because of COVID-19 to get us back. That's a little bit less than the Great Recession, but it's starting to have that feel. So if you add up everything I've told you thus far, the forecast is decent, not spectacular. We have had some labor market momentum slowed down, and that conversion from temporary job loss to permanent is a key feature of how fast we recover. So that slow moving slope going up toward 110.0 is a function of having temporary job losses not come back to work that quickly and potentially convert to permanent. Now, let's look at Butte County. Same graph as above. A little bit more seasonal aspects of this, as you're going to see a lot more bumpy ride. I did, again, not take the seasonality out of this because it really doesn't matter for this analysis in terms of just looking at the trend. Same kind of bowl shape, down we go after November 2007, then slowly getting back up. It took about 95 months for Butte County to get back to the original number of people working in Butte County. It was at November 2007. So about, almost 8 years, more or less. Well, here is COVID-19. Notice very similar to the state and the national picture. So where the national picture, the state picture, and the Butte County picture all look a little bit different with respect to how the Great Recession evolved, especially in its recovery, this one looks all very similar. The difference is in magnitude. In some cases, it's a little less in terms of the initial job loss. In some cases, it's a little bit more. Now, notice, at one point, Butte County almost got back up to about 97% of the amount of people working in Butte County that was there at the beginning of 2020, and the last couple of months have been a little bit tough. So just like the other two pictures, we need to get that black line toward the red to feel like we are actually in recovery mode, and it needs to happen month on month on month on month. We kind of knew this slippage was going to take place because we expected caseloads to rise again. Here it is in living color. Now, same deal. We're going to look now at a bunch of industries over the last 7 or 8 months now. I take that back, over the last 9 months. Here is April 2020 in Butte County. You can see same kind of industries with major effects, leisure and hospitality, other services being the big ones. Then there's May, June, July, August. Now you're actually seeing some positive movements because we started to reopen the economy back up. September, October. Now we're starting to close the economy again in California and specifically in different places. November, and then December. So just like the state, Butte County had to give back a little bit of that labor market momentum, but actually is doing a little bit better than the state. Remember, we saw that in that earlier graph where we showed the labor market update, that sort of the high level numbers for December versus last December. These suggest that at the industrial level, most of the industries are recovering, but there's still some pretty big ones that are hurting. Wholesale trade, the professional business services, leisure and hospitality. Some of this is also driven by the fact that for Butte County, CSU Chico has not been physically open, which has slowed down a lot of the sort of secondary and tertiary effects of having the college open. But we will see over the next few months if we start to get some momentum in terms of just more travelers, and then ultimately in fall, we get our college campuses back open again. But these data tell you a story that Butte County is doing okay, slightly better than California, still not that great, and we still have some room to recover, but recovery momentum is there. Now, where recovery has been very strong has been in housing. And Butte County, unfortunately, has had a wild couple of years based on the fires in 2018 with respect to housing. And you can see that here. And now I'm going to shade Butte County. The last year or so, the price growth, what these data are median price growth looking back 1 year in blue, looking back 2 years in orange or sort of red-orange with respect to December 2020 pricing. So there was such a run-up in Butte County of prices based on the contraction of supply after the fire that we had slowed down a little bit for the last year, but none of these are negative. And notice there's a bunch of different comparisons to rural California as well as a little bit more urban in terms of Sacramento and then California overall. But the reason this is happening is because, again, low interest rates, people moving from rental to purchase situations where they can, and also moving around the state with permanent changes in maybe the way you're working. That's helping a lot of places around California either maintain or see growth in home prices. Now, that leads to, at least in theory, more discussions about a lack of affordability once all this is over. Here's the forecast, very positive across the board. Even Butte County, represented by the Chico MSA here, is about 10% growth over the next year. A lot of this driven by the same factors. We don't see those factors changing. Maintain low interest rates, people still looking to move from rental to purchase. All those conditions, especially if we see continued economic recovery, should be good for the housing market. Now, unfortunately, not everybody participates in the housing market. So one of the things that's concerning the Biden White House, concerning the governor's office in California, is the split in terms of the recovery between high wage workers, the blue line, and low wage workers, the green line. That split in California, as you'll see in a minute, is relatively typical across the United States. There's high wage workers, there's low wage workers. And if we look at Butte County, this is the split from January 2020, the job losses or the job gains. You'll notice now, unfortunately, the high wage is in green and the low wage is in blue. But the high wage, notice, is actually positive, meaning that there's been growth of folks who are working, who make at least $60,000 a year in Butte County, according to these data, and I'll explain these data in just a minute. The lower wage workers make less than $27,000 a year. They fell and have seen some ups and downs, but basically have been flat across the entire period. The high wage workers have picked up a little bit here recently, at least to the end of October. Both of these are likely trending down a little bit based on what we just saw before, but here's the story. Harvard University, in partnership with the Gates Foundation, is using all kinds of big data sources to track the movement of employment and also the movement of businesses that remain open or closed. These data at least reflect for right now that split is wide, and why that's important is because at some point we're going to be talking about equity in terms of trying to get those lower wage workers picked back up. So we know there's rising social services demand. We know there's rising demand on nonprofits. A lot of our apartment owners are concerned about people leaving their apartment or not being able to pay. Either one of those is going to change their cash flows. And then ultimately, if people do leave because they can't afford to stay where they are due to income changes and a lack of potential work at lower wage jobs, that can lead to a migration out of a local labor force. And this is more at the longer term, to where when businesses want to hire back, they're going to be swimming around looking for people. I have some insider takes from Tehama County, for example, and this is true in Butte County as well, where there's a struggle to find workers. Not so much that businesses aren't hiring, they're just having a problem actually finding those workers. So those are some things to think about on the labor market side. On the small business side, that same database tracks the evolution of businesses that have 500 people or less, but really for most of California, this is 25 workers or less. And how many businesses were open in January 2020, not open at the end of the year. You can see that maybe in leisure and hospitality, bars, restaurants, and hotels, almost half of those businesses do not have a presence online or in their payroll tax receipts or in the sum of those parts that suggest they're currently open. What we don't know is if they're permanently closed or they're closed for social restriction reasons. You can see those sort of bumps and clunks along the way as social restrictions became less of a problem or more of a problem. These data are samples, not point forecasts in California, but they do tell the story. And that split between the total and leisure and hospitality really tells a story of how the travel-related industries in California have been hurting more than others. Well, here's Butte County, Tehama County, and Shasta County, according to this database, with respect to the number of businesses that are currently closed. Again, we don't know if these are permanently closed or temporarily closed due to social restrictions, but the idea is that these smaller businesses have a larger threat in terms of not being able to lean on other markets to get through the tough times. A lot of these are also going to be our self-owned businesses. Now, whether or not these are true or not, that it could be somewhere between 38% and 50% across the North State is an open question, but it certainly suggests that at least for the time being, there's enough businesses that have reduced the capacity of the local economies to generate income that we need to start thinking about what that means for local government in terms of revenues that they're going to get if there's a lack of capacity of business transactions. So there's that sort of grouping according to these data. And that loss of restaurants or hotels can be tricky in terms of being able to support visitors. We're waiting to see what happens on the other side of this and see how many of those businesses actually reopen according to these data, but really just according to anecdote and eyesight in our downtowns and really around our communities. And if that changes pricing, because there's fewer competitors in the short term, but we know the cost of operations are going to go up. So small business is going to have lingering threats, but for anything else, the increased cost of doing business. Okay, I want to now look and start wrapping up with the population evolution in Butte County. These data are going to tell a story that we kind of already know, but it reminds us about what's been happening with Butte County and its population. We know the fires affected it. We've seen some wild data come out of the last couple of years about Butte County, but what these data are going to tell you is sort of breaking down the components of growth. We just got these data about a month ago from the Department of Finance and their demographers. Here's the births in Butte County over the last 20 years. Here are the deaths. So you can see that those are relatively equal, meaning that most of the dynamics of the population in Butte County were really more about inbound and outbound migration. Well, here's inbound folks from other countries. So not a whole lot here, but where most of the action has been is the movement of people from other parts of the United States in net. So for years, Butte County was attracting more residents. The last 2 years post-fire, a lot of people have left. And that's forced the population down. But we did see some get back a little bit in terms of not having as deep a loss as we saw in 2019, but we knew that loss was going to come. What's important here is that this can change the way in which our local schools work, our local businesses work, our local governments gain access to revenue. And I know all those questions are swirling around Butte County, but this is just another data point that happens to be tied to Butte County directly as a way of monitoring change. So keep that in mind. To wrap up, folks, some of the things that you should be watching and really start thinking about as far as the more, let's say, 2021 to 2025 path. Low interest rates are going to continue. Nothing should really change that besides economic growth and ultimately Federal Reserve policy. But we have to watch and see how much fiscal spending does change inflation flows. We're watching home prices. We, for right now, think we're going to avoid a downturn. We need to see that play out. And some of it's because urban to suburban to rural movements are changing fortunes for the time being in certain places around California. But whether or not that stops and changes, a lot still depends on where people are going to want to live and work. That split in that recovery. For some folks, our higher wage workers, hasn't been a big deal on average. For our lower wage workers, especially those in those larger hit industries that generally involve travel, but are really about people gathering in the same place, bars, restaurants, hotels, event facilities, big split there. Our urban areas are more exposed than our rural areas to this, but watch how that becomes policy around equity over time. Our public sectors are not out of the woods. California looks like it's better than it was 6 months ago, or at least the prediction of where we were 6 months ago has been beat thus far, but our cities and counties are still hurting. And we have to see relief come all the way down to the city level at some point, or we're not going to have the ability to necessarily provide as many social services as necessary to take those lower wage workers and get them to turn the corner. So watch for that. Even though housing has stayed stable, other revenue sources do threaten how many social services can be provided and what volume can be sustained. Key challenge is actually managing debt, not only at the national level, but really at the household level. If we don't see labor market recovery and we don't feel like we're on the right path, people will start using credit cards to get by in the short term, and that can change fortunes all the way to housing, depending on what final decisions are made with respect to bankruptcies and ultimately your ability to stay in your home, whether it's rental or you own. If I don't get to your question, folks, please email me as you see here. But if you do have a question, please put it in the chat. I don't see anything in the chat thus far. And I apologize if I didn't say that we were in the chat as far as questions, but if you do have a question, I can hang out for a couple minutes and see if I get some action in the chat. Worst case, email me at that email address or hit me up on Twitter at that Twitter handle, and I will take care of you. But folks, thank you again for taking the time today. And thank you, Marta, for that. And otherwise, folks, we will let you go. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thanks to AFWD for sponsoring, and take care.